All right. Here we are with Julius Spradley. Is that how you pronounce the last name?
Yep, you got it.
From Contemplative Icons. All right. So before we get too hammered into it, I found some of your artwork because it was shared on Twitter by some other people. And I think I saw the one that was of the Cappadocian Fathers. And I just
Yeah.
thought, well, I love all of these figures. And then I quickly looked over at your website and I saw that you're doing also, you have the Alexandrians and the Mystics. And I'm a fan of iconography and all that stuff. So you
Yeah.
might want to be in the center of your screen just for a quick moment. There you go. Now you're in the middle.
Yeah.
So how'd you get into this, man?
Yeah. So it kind of happened through a number of different avenues, sort of all meeting and intersecting around the same time. Uh, so I was really first introduced to icons and sort of the lives of saints in the early church through seminary. I
Okay.
attended Redeemer Seminary in Dallas, Texas, which sadly no longer exists, but it
Okay.
did for a short, really wonderful time. I finished up at the end of 2016. Um, and so through that, I really just developed a love for the early church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, really found out sort of a lot of the theology behind icons, a lot of the early controversies and everything, and found that to be really interesting, just sort of as an area to study.
Right.
At the time, I wasn't even thinking anything about sort of creating them. Um, but
Oh,
that sort of stuck with me. And then I was actually starting to kind of learn how to draw and sketch icons for a wood carving project, actually, that I was thinking
really?
of
That's
doing. I
fun.
was trying to, yeah, I was kind of looking around trying to figure out some ways to carve like a relief icon. Um, so I started sketching, started trying to learn from some people, a lot of people online who had some great resources, and I never even attempted the wood carvings. I just kept drawing. I couldn't really stop
Okay.
uh, sketching. It just kind of kept going and going, and so that was sort of my entrance into sort of the actual artistic side of things. And then um, yeah, just the more I learned about a lot of these saints that I was sort of practicing drawing, the more drawn in I got to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the same time, just sort of lastly, in my personal life, I was being drawn much more to kind of the more sensory areas of faith and worship,
Wow.
especially in the liturgy, much more than sort of what I felt like I had been doing, which was just
Mm-hmm.
kind of downloading a sermon transcript into my brain, and
Mm-hmm.
that was about it.
Yeah.
Um, so, so yeah, so all of this sort of combined at the same time, right before the pandemic hit. I went out to California to learn from some really great folks, just sort of some of the painting techniques.
Wait, so you
Um,
traveled to
and then,
California to learn about how to do that?
yeah,
In
yeah.
specific.
So
Wow.
yeah, so it's icons are sort of the old way of doing it is painting it in egg tempera style, which is the best way to describe it is just like oil painting, but instead of uh, linseed oil being what binds the pigment together, it's egg yolks that bind
Yeah.
the pigment together. So learning how to do that specifically for icons is, there's not many workshops out there, at
No.
least in the United States.
Yeah.
There's some in Europe and everything, but at the time I was still in Dallas, and California was the closest to go to. So I did that, came back, and a week later, the whole country shut down, and I was given a lot of time to practice.
Wow. So this actually completely coincides with COVID. Um, I
Yeah,
actually got my
definitely.
first icon. It's actually this one. I got the Trinity one right behind me.
Okay. Yeah.
That's like a classic one. But then I kind of went into a
Yeah.
spurt of buying a whole bunch of them. And so now I've got
Oh,
ones in every single room of my place here. You might know the classic, like the Resurrection one.
yeah.
That's a pretty
Yeah.
normal
That's
one.
great.
But I think honestly, my favorite is this one that's of creation. Oh boy.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just because it's so
Great.
colorful. But obviously, these are printed, or I guess they're matted on wood. And I understand that
Mhm.
icons usually have far more intricate layers, and sometimes gold is actually folded into it, which is absolutely amazing. But
Yeah.
I went to seminary as well here in Philly, and I felt as
Mhm.
though they would drop all these names of all these famous people from church history, but then we rarely talked about them. And then I felt as though I was like, well, I'm just going to go study these people more on my own. And so actually, just yesterday, I got a volume of Gregory of Nyssa,
Uh-huh.
just 7 works from him. And it's just some of these figures are just amazing. And I'm curious, do you have a favorite one?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm by no means an expert in any of them, any of these figures, and certainly not even wouldn't even really consider myself super well read in them. But the Cappadocian fathers, I started with them. Um, really, um, Saint Basil, however
Yeah. Hmm.
you prefer to pronounce it. He really, for whatever reason, there've been certain saints who, whenever I just kind of sit down with a sketchbook and a pencil, I just kind of naturally start sketching.
That's
And
amazing.
Saint Basil's one of them. Um, he's the one who has works that sort of are out there that are read. John the Baptist is the other, but he didn't write much.
No.
So it's been sort of my entrance was through some of these Cappadocian fathers and learning about Saint Macrina, learning
Hmm.
Nissa's Life of Moses, and some of these texts that I either read in seminary or were sort of tangential to some of the stuff that I read, and kind of found it later.
So when you're drawing these, do you find yourself going into a is it worshipful to make these? Do you feel like you're getting into it in a different way?
Yeah, sometimes it's not in like a I don't slip into a trance or
No.
anything.
Yeah, yeah.
I can get obsessive in other ways and lose track of time, but it's there's not like a cloud that hangs over me or anything.
No.
It's definitely worshipful in that it's just sort of a dedicated time of study, and I think of it as sort of studying and worshiping through my hands. Um,
Wow.
my mind is certainly engaged, and I'm certainly thinking through. So I think some of my favorite parts of iconography has been learning about all the like geometry that goes on in the background, and as you're sort of sketching, and you showed me your two icons are both of scenes. They're not just simply a saint or a depiction of Christ, but there's other stuff going on. So how you sort of create harmony among all the different elements. So there's just all these different layers that you were sort of alluding to that all draw me in different ways. So it feels
Wow.
like a really sort of almost like holistic way of
Hmm.
um, certainly worshiping. Um, but it, I don't know. It's kind of the way that we talk about worship today. I feel like it doesn't. It's not like a big emotional experience. It's not sort
No.
of a slipping into a different kind of state of being. It's just it feels really simple. It feels really
Mm.
um, even I mean contemplative so far is the best word that I can think to describe it. So that's why I kind of named it that. But
That's so
um,
good. Yeah,
yeah,
and
that's sort
I
of how it
think the
feels.
phrase contemplative comes from the Latin word contemplatio, which that sounds so pedantic, like I'm an arrogant person, but it just means to look
No,
deeply. It just means that you look deeply at things. I think that's so
yeah,
helpful. And I had no idea that there was geometry and harmony in the background of icons.
oh
There's
yeah,
like a
yeah.
whole just that's blowing my
Well, I
mind.
mean the one behind you, the famous icon of the Trinity.
Right.
There's so many studies that have been done on that sort of the shape that the three figures make is sort of the shape of a cup. Um, there's a sacramental sort of everything flows around sort of the sacrament in the middle. There's just sort of if you look at so this is going to be kind of hard to translate through an audio sort of podcast, but
That's okay.
if you just look up Andrei Rublev's Icon of the Trinity, there's just articles and all kinds of drawings on top of drawings of sort of patterns that people have noticed in it, and that's really what makes it a masterpiece. It's just so incredibly intricate, and just the way that it's designed before he ever starts painting it, it's pretty incredible.
Well, and even the colors, is that right? The
Oh yeah,
colors of
yeah,
each of the persons symbolize things. That's what I think is so profound, is that we think of pictures as needing to be, what's the word, accurate, not realizing that
yeah.
things are communicated symbolically. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I think a way that I can't remember who it was, but the way it was explained to me was um, that iconography is completely about representing figures realistically, but not naturalistically. Um, so the
Right.
idea is that you are representing something that is incredibly real and present, um, but it's sort of in essence sort of depicting almost a glorified body rather than sort of one that you see sitting right across the table from you.
So is that why the dimensions of the bodies and icons sometimes look a little strange? Or is that just
Yeah,
because it was before Renaissance when they started paying attention to that?
no, it's designed, and different traditions develop different ways. So, the shape, sort of body posture of a Russian icon is going to look different than a Greek one. Um, so
Amazing.
as they sort of developed, in different sort of cultural, I guess, adaptations, um, they take on sort of the philosophy and the sort of the culture that they're in. So, there have been studies done where the faces and icons for the Greek Orthodox tend to look like sort of old depictions of Greek philosophers. They kind of depict them in the same ways to sort of speak the same language
Mm.
of their people. There's different schools in Russian iconography where the bodies are really elongated and made to look almost more elegant and kind of like they're floating almost. There's some just really cool different ways that um, it's realistic. You still see, there's two eyes, there's a nose, there's a mouth.
Yeah.
You know sort of how everything fits together. But the different ways that different iconographers throughout time and in different cultures have chosen
Mm.
to sort of elongate one thing or shorten another, and everything
That's
is
amazing.
really just about language and culture. And every iconographer in their time is trying to you know have this visual theology of
Mm.
this sort of yeah, of just sort
That's
of depicting it
amazing.
to a culture. I wish I could say that's mine, but it's not. There,
So
there's plenty of other people talk about that, but yeah,
I'm absolutely fascinated by everything that you just said, because it makes me think that iconography actually is a kind of, there's like a discipline, and you said there's different schools of thought about how to do it, and it's
yeah,
trying to depict things real no realistically but not naturally, or was it the other way?
yes, no, you got it. That a lot of some iconography really survives through the East. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
In the West, a lot of religious art, you think of the Sistine Chapel, you think of like Michelangelo and sort of these high Renaissance guys, but the
Right.
Renaissance really only happens in the West. It doesn't happen in the East. Um, so in Greece and in Russia, they don't really experience this Renaissance and this turn towards sort of naturalism and having sort of a disappearing point in the horizon and a single point that
Mm.
everything's sort of focused around. Because the Renaissance certainly has tons of symbolism and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of some of the same stuff, but it's just kind of the way you depict the human form changes. Um,
Now,
but in the East, where these iconographers were still working, um, there's some crossover and there's some influence, but they sort of retain this idea of it's not naturalistic. I've never seen a person who looks like that, but I can recognize that that is a person.
Of
So
course.
it's
Yeah.
real, it's realistically done, but it's not sort of, naturalism that, oh, your nose really
Right.
wouldn't be that long or something. Yeah.
Now, I'm, I understand that there was a massive, what was it, in the 1100s, there was iconoclasm when iconography
Hmm.
was, the pieces were just being destroyed because people in the West didn't understand them and misunderstood them as being idolatrous. I actually never understood it that way. I kind of understood it as like these are windows through which you look. Not only that, but
Yeah.
my goodness, how many people were actually literate back in the day? So of course you would
Yeah.
need to use pictures in order to, I love the phrase you just used, visual theology. Is like
Yeah.
before people learn how to read, they see pictures, and that's how theology was probably communicated through all of the centuries. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, especially, printing press is sort
Yeah.
of where we point to say, like, this is when people were able to have Bibles in their own language, much less Bibles in the home. So there really was just this long, long period of time where, even trying to translate, things across languages, sometimes visuals are a bit easier to
Mm,
translate. So yeah, there've been a number of sort of iconoclastic controversies. So times where, there's it becomes a growing sentiment that these icons are depictions of, say, statues as well, like any
mm-hmm,
sort of depiction of the physical body of Christ, especially, but the saints as well, comes
mm,
under just controversy of whether that should be allowed or not, if it breaks the second commandment or not. It's happened, in Protestantism. It happened a couple times in the East, um, and you have these figures that sort of rise up um, and sort of argue. So, Saint John of Damascus was a great
mm.
example of someone who argued for um, the the preserving of icons, which ultimately won out.
Right. You made mention that the East had some debates about iconoclasm. I thought it was
Yeah.
between the East and the West.
I there were some disagreements between the East and West. In the West, a lot of the like like iconoclastic sort of controversies were between, around the Reformation. It was between Protestants and Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of that was reacting to a lot of Catholic use of images and statues and things. But in the West, or sorry, in the East, you also, around the 600s and 700s, you start to have sort of the contact with Islam, contact with
Oh, okay.
um, a lot of these cultures where, in Islam, you don't depict Muhammad at all,
Mm-hmm.
visually. So it's not necessarily that Christians started adopting that view of God as well, but it becomes that sort of a controversy,
Mm.
where basically the argument that wins out from John of Damascus, is
Mm.
that, well, Christ decided to put on visual, actual flesh and matter. So what we are depicting is not trying to depict, God the Father in heaven in sort of
Okay.
an incorporeal way or anything like that. It's no, these are people who lived and continue to live within the great cloud of saints. They still are with
Okay.
us. So you mentioned thinking about it as windows. I think that's a great way to sort of enter
Okay.
into sort of how you relate to icons. People will call them windows into heaven, which I
That's
think,
beautiful.
it makes some sense. It's not an idea though of, a window into heaven, like heaven's up there somewhere,
Yeah.
and we're looking up there. Rather, it's a window into the saints who are here on the ground with us.
Right.
Um, that that these saints, all of this is around us. It's in Hebrews, the great cloud of witnesses that are with us today.
Right.
It's that sort of participation that I think iconography really fosters.
You think you the word participation? You think
Hmm.
what do you mean by participation in that? That sounds Eastern Orthodox, which I'm totally a fan of it. But
Yeah.
participating in God through these things?
Um, well, now you're getting into like theosis and everything. I didn't mean it in that way.
Okay.
I'm with you. I'm not Eastern Orthodox. I just obviously interact with it a lot and
Hmm.
appreciate it quite a bit. But I just mean participating in the sense of, it's not simply just a nicely painted picture of a saint that you particularly like that hangs on
Right.
your wall, just like any other photo. It's not like a weird thing where it's like an entrance to Narnia or anything like that. Um it's just more of a, I don't know, it's one of those things that sometimes our language just doesn't quite get
Mm,
to,
yeah.
um
Is
into what that looks like. But yeah.
I might be getting this wrong. Is it left brain is the logical brain, the right brain is the artistic?
I can never remember,
I
but
can't.
sure.
Yeah, me too. Well, my thought was, so I was raised in the Lutheran church, and then bounced around like Presbyterianism, worked at a Baptist camp, went to a non-denominational seminary, heard about all these people. So like along the way, I've started reading more and more Catholic, and then more and more Eastern Orthodox, all
Mhm.
around. But what I found is we're so word centric, like you said, and then the whole sensory thing sometimes gets left off. So I've been to Protestant churches. I
Yeah.
went to this massive one in DC a long time ago, and it had nothing on the walls, no art. It was like an auditorium, and then there's just a stage up in front with a podium, maybe to be minimalist or maybe just to be whatever is the opposite of Catholic. But I
Uh-huh.
remember thinking in that moment, there's like no beauty to this experience right here.
Sure.
So that's interesting that you also noticed the shift towards the more sensory type things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, as I've sort of interacted with other iconographers who, 99% of them are Eastern Orthodox, and
Wow.
when I was able to go out to California and learn from some, and just the way that they approached just sort of the day and how they, sat down to paint, it was, again, it's not like you slip into this trance where you're not aware of what's
Mhm.
going around on around you or anything. It's just sort of this acceptance um, of maybe just there aren't words right now. Like,
Mm.
not like you're trying to be silent or trying to. It's that's what I mean, I guess, by sensory
Yeah.
is not so much that you feel things, quote unquote, but that it's um, just kind of through your hands. It's
Is
not
there
something that we get really comfortable with. That I'm
yeah.
still not comfortable with, but it's helpful.
Yeah. Do you have a top 2 or 3 icons that you've ever seen? What are some of your favorite
Ooh.
ones?
Um, let's see. So there's sort of a new school, that's kind of been coming about the last 20 or 30 years, really since the fall of the Soviet Union.
Really?
Because because icons were, I mean, they were banned during the Soviet Union. So
Wow.
Russian, or you couldn't produce any new ones. People were doing it underground.
I did
It
not
was
know that.
really pretty crazy. And so apparently a lot of these big art museums in like Moscow and St. Petersburg and some of these places, they hid a lot of their icons like in the basements and everything. And then when the Soviet Union fell, they brought them back out again. And a lot of sort of modern iconography started from these conservators who were, you know, everyone had basically died off at that point who really knew how to paint icons.
Oh, okay.
And so they started learning it from there. So to answer your question of some that really strike me, a lot of what's coming out of, especially the Ukraine right now, and I'll send you a list of their names that you can put in show notes or something, because I'm
Okay.
not going to try to pronounce
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Uh, but a lot of what's coming out of Ukraine these days are just these. They're very modern. They almost don't look like what you thought of as icons classically, but they're just really, I don't know. They're really beautiful, and they have this. this effect on me, at least,
Mm.
where it's
Mm-hmm.
um again, it's probably not great for a podcast because I don't really know the words to describe it, but it's just this sort of feeling of being drawn in, um, where you're not trying to kind of gather all the different elements at once. You're not trying to necessarily
Mm.
understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But there's especially like Maxim Shashukov is one who I feel comfortable pronouncing.
Okay.
But he has these just the postures that some of his um, saints are in. They're really elongated and they're really sort of bent around, and they have these sort of expressions on their faces that I don't know how to describe it. It's just sort of this beautiful drawing in. Um, again, the word participation is coming to
That's
mind, but
amazing.
it's just sort of these saints sort of drawing you with them, whether it's depictions of
Yeah.
martyrdom or of like the baptism of Christ is a very popular one, I guess, among this new school
I went
of
to
just
the
placing you with it.
well, that's what art is supposed to do. Just like going to a concert, it's supposed to affect you. And
Yeah,
that's part of it. You don't just go and appreciate the skill set by which they make paintings with the colors and things. Like, what does it produce in you?
right.
How do you respond to it? Does it like beckon your soul? Like, why does this piece of art speak to me more, and then you over there, this piece? It's just, I
Yeah.
got the chance to stand in front of Starry Night a few weeks
Hmm.
ago. And I was in New
Hmm.
York City, and I remember there was a line of people, and they were going up to it to take a picture of it, but then they would go stand at the picture, the painting, and they turn their back to it and take a selfie with it, and their bodies
Sure.
blocking like 2/3 of the actual Starry Night,
Uh-huh.
and then they would shuffle off to the next room. I'm like, no, you should just stand in front of this and just stare in silence and be affected by it. Man.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of what just came to mind is, there's sort of a Celtic Christian understanding of thin places, of
Okay.
there are places sort of a lot of times it might have been where a saint or like a very righteous monk or someone um, lived and died and maybe was buried there, where it's just this place where it just feels like the sort of the barrier between this life and the next, between earth and heaven, is really thin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that there's just something extra that's sort of bypassing between the two. Um, that
Wow.
that that sort of feeling that happens, like you said, when you're at a concert or when you're standing in front of a painting, or really in any capacity encountering beauty. It can be through the written word, of course, but just in any way that you're encountering beauty, it feels like this sort of thinning of that barrier for me. So
Oh
when
yeah.
I'm painting, it, it kind of just feels, I guess maybe that's the participation I've been trying to get at the whole time, is that it feels like participating in that, creating that sort of window, um, whether it's for me or for other people. I mean,
Yeah.
it's almost always for other people, but yeah,
But
it's a really humbling but really worshipful sort of experience.
and there's something to be said that, okay, if God is creator, then actually we are being very godlike when we're being creative.
Hmm.
And that's, to be creative is different than being productive. And that's one of the problems
Yes.
definitely with today's culture.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big thing. And even just too, like I feel like we've sort of created just these separate disciplines of creativity of,
What do you mean? Say more.
there's, well, so my undergrad is actually in creative writing. That's what
Nice.
I studied in college, and it's just sort of, there was in college, you have a visual arts department, you have a theater department, a music department, creative writing department. We just sort of split these disciplines up, and they don't really cross over. They don't really communicate with philosophy department or a theology department or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that, but really they're all sort of participating in each other because it is sort of a pursuit of these, I guess, these classic transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Yeah.
That they're
Mm-hmm.
not distinct from one another, but they're, all
It's like
mutually
Trinity. They're
growing each
just
other. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
perichoresis.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's a lot of what we sort of are not losing, but just that we're just uncomfortable with. It kind of feels
Mm.
like you said, it's not productive. It's also not performance, and it's not um, precision. Um, it's not trying to
No.
sort of hit the bullseye on a target. It's just kind of understanding there might not be a target, and you're just sort of sitting with it. Um, and we don't like to sit with things.
No, not at all. We love to explain things because if you can explain it, then somehow you can control the experience of it. But
Yeah, exactly.
the creative arts are not about control. They're about obviously experience and being taken into something almost unwilling.
Engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's unwilling. It's not like it's unconsensual or anything. It's just more like it's sort of an enrapturing and engaging,
Yeah.
participating. It's how we relate to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's it's all reflected in each other, I think, and I think that's what gets lost.
Mm. I'm going to see if we can do this. Let me look over at this. So this is actually your website. For I understand there are some people who might
Okay,
be
yeah.
listening, but this will be on YouTube. But contemplative iconography. This is first off aesthetically, it's a beautiful website too. But
Thanks.
I mean, that's a dapper man. Um, but up at the top, when I looked at some of these, where's the menu? There we go. Some of your prints, it looked like they have some of that the elongated bodies, like how you had mentioned. So some
Hmm.
of these ones of the Cappadocians, they look kind of tall. Some of the mystics over here, the Alexandrians, I'm I'm amazed. These are just fantastic. But did you?
Well, thank
How
you.
long
But
do they take you to do each one? And then do you have another one you're already getting worked on?
well, so I just finished up the Mystics. Um, really just last week, earlier this week. So that one's the newest one. Um, but yeah, these don't take me probably as long as you think because it's all digital. I'm not sitting down painting.
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of you know doodle, I guess, a little bit more with these, and so they don't take too terribly long. But so the elongation you mentioned, sort of the people who I learned um, sort of proportions and those sorts of things from. Um, I think she was taught in Greece. She studied with um, Giorgis Kordis and some of these just kind of amazing artists in Athens.
Mm.
And so, sort of the proportions I was taught is basically like, a nose or a head is 3 or 4 noses high, and a body is 8 heads high, and you sort of just
Really?
kind of create these ratios. Yeah, like your shoulders are a head and a half wide. And it's kind of wild when you kind of just like measure it on yourself a little bit or something, and it's
That's
like,
kind
oh,
of
that kind of
amazing.
is. Um, so you just kind of have these proportion, quote unquote, rules, and that's some of
Yeah.
the geography or not the geometry behind
Geometry.
it
Yeah.
that, yeah, that I was alluding to earlier, where um, you sort of have these structures in place that are really traditional. Um, and I don't at all feel like constrained by them. It actually feels it's really freeing because it's just basically someone sets up all the scaffolding for you, and you can just kind of go to work.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's where a lot of what seems sometimes elongated, sometimes um, like some traditions, the foreheads look really big.
Mm-hmm. I've
Um,
seen those. Yeah.
beards, yeah, beards look really long and pointed, and um, I like to just kind of mess around. I'm an American, so there's not really an American school of iconography. There's not really an American tradition of iconography. There's plenty of wonderful American iconographers, but it doesn't have, there. If you're studying iconography in St. Petersburg in Russia, you have, centuries and centuries and centuries of Russian iconographers that you're sort of participating with. I, I love learning from sort of Greek style iconographers, Russians, Ukrainians, Crete. Cretan iconography is really beautiful, and a lot of like Romanian stuff. So there's all these different kinds that I feel like I'm lucky to just sort of encounter all at once, and kind of experiment with and just kind of say, okay, I'm going to kind of, maybe this icon might end up looking like I pulled all the colors from a Russian icon, but it's structured like a Greek icon. I'm not necessarily thinking these things, but it's
amazing.
Just very, I don't know. It feels right for sort of the context that we're in, and a really global, and being one of, there's not many American iconographers. There's really brilliant, really talented ones, but there's just not too many of them. Not too many of us, I guess.
No, it sounds like it's a small community. So I only have a few more questions, but like, how did you find out who to search out to study from?
Well, initially I just kind of searched. I was like, okay, I've been learning and drawing and kind of learning online through, people's YouTube channels, through Patreon subscriptions, those kinds of things. And really everyone's kind of all over the English speaking world. That I learned a lot from that sort of Greek style iconographer. She was actually South African. Aiden Hart is a phenomenal living iconographer. He is in England, and he's written a few books on iconography. So I learned, through some of his books that are really, really great. So I just kind of Googled, like, is anybody doing this in the United States that I can learn from? I was in living in Dallas still at the time, and there actually is a master iconographer who lives in
Dallas, Texas.
Dallas. Yeah, he did the cathedral there and just kind of stayed. He's from the Ukraine, and at the time he was, I think, in Ohio painting a church or something.
Wow.
So you just kind of searched around, and through word of mouth of, everyone's really giving and really kind. And,
okay.
There might be like, I'm out of state for the next 4 months, so I can't really look at your stuff and give you any thoughts, but so-and-so can, or maybe talk to someone else. And Christine Hales is the woman. She's an iconographer who, I think she lives in Florida now, who does some workshops. And she happened to have one in California, and the options are California or upstate New York. And in March I chose California. So
that's amazing.
That was just sort of how I wound up there, and found a few other people who I kind of keep up with through probably the 10 of us who were there. And then I've just sort of found others, and through social media, just kind of reach out and talk shop, or just say, hey, I really appreciate your work. And it's there's still aren't many in the United States. There's a couple in Canada that I can think of, but it's really just very, very global at this point.
I'm kind of amazed that you got the contemplativeicons.com. I figured that website would have been claimed by now. So kudos to you. But
thanks. Yeah, I guess I got lucky on that one.
But honestly, I hope it launches off. I hope it goes really well, man. I'm actually going to order.
Thanks.
I'm not lying too. I didn't do it yet, but I'm actually going to order the Mystic one later this afternoon after we're done with this. Because I like the Cappadocians. I haven't read too many of the Alexandrians, maybe at some point, but I want to say I got close to saying reading Teresa of Avila and Dark Night of the Soul and St. John of the Cross, reading at least those two maybe saved my life. So
Sure. Yeah.
those figures are just amazing. And I think, well, of the three that you had done, the Cappadocians, the Alexandrians, and the Mystics there's riches that, for good or bad, the Protestant church hasn't even gotten a chance to look at yet. And there's so much good stuff there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that one I just did. I was pretty pleased with it, but that one had been sitting with me for a while. That one had been fun to do.
Oh yeah.
And then we'll see. I don't know. There's not necessarily plans for a fourth one. I'm sure there will be a fourth one, maybe a fifth one. I don't really know how far it'll go.
Yeah.
As long as I keep coming up with these sort of quartets of saints.
Well, there's a lot of people who have made COVID businesses, obviously. Since COVID started, people found themselves having all of a sudden all this extra time. And at least you took that extra time and took it to be creative. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to link to contemplativeicons.com. Your Twitter here is contemplative icons, but no vowels in any of the word contemplative.
Yeah. I didn't. So Twitter limits you to however many characters in a handle, I guess.
Okay.
So contemplative icons didn't quite fit. I didn't have that problem on Instagram, so they're a bit different from each other. But yeah, that's the reason for the funky spelling.
Gotcha. Well, again, I hope the business kicks off, and it's anytime somebody takes a venture into being creative, they need to be rewarded and congratulated. So well done. Thank you for your time, man.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thanks.